My name is Celine Moore. I'm 32 years old. And for as long as I can remember, I've been invisible in my own family. Everyone thought I was the responsible, reliable daughter, the one who helped run our family's restaurant empire, handled the accounts, and made sure everything ran smoothly. But to my parents, I was never enough. Not glamorous enough, not charming enough, not anything enough. That title, the golden child, was always reserved for my little sister, Lydia. And they made sure I knew it every single day. Growing up in the shadow of Lydia Moore was exhausting. My mother, Vivian, always had this cold, calculated way of smiling at Lydia as if she were a precious jewel, while I got cold lectures about why I wasn't trying hard enough. My father, Gregory, never openly hurt me, but I could feel his disappointment like a constant weight pressing down on me, reminding me that no matter what I achieved, it would never be enough. Even as a teenager, I was handling the business side of things, managing suppliers, balancing ledgers, and calming disputes between staff, while Lydia spent hours at the spa or shopping, pretending to care about the restaurants but never lifting a finger. And yet, when praise was handed out, it was always her name on their lips, never mine. By the time I was 25, I thought I had found my escape. Caleb Wright, my fiancé, someone I believed actually saw me, not the shadow of my sister. He was charming, smart, and seemed genuinely proud of what I had built. I thought, maybe, just maybe, someone outside my family could finally see me for who I really was. But life has a cruel way of showing you the truth when you least expect it. The cracks had already begun, though I couldn't see them. The way Lydia lingered too long around Caleb, the fleeting looks, the quiet whispers in hallways. I convinced myself I was imagining it. Surely my sister wouldn't betray me. Surely Caleb wouldn't. And surely my parents, well, they'd finally notice me. I was wrong. The day started like any other. I was reviewing the new quarterly reports in my office, checking emails, and making sure everything was ready for the upcoming investor meeting. Lydia called, pretending to be sweet, asking for my advice on some minor detail about the menus. But there was a strange undertone in her voice I couldn't place. It was deliberate, calculated. I should have known then that everything I had worked for, everything I had trusted, was about to collapse. The engagement party should have been a celebration, a moment where I could finally feel seen and appreciated. But as soon as I walked into the grand hall of the Moore estate, draped with sparkling lights and floral arrangements, I felt that old, familiar weight pressing on my chest. Everything was perfect on the surface. Smiling guests, clinking glasses, laughter echoing through the halls. But beneath it, a subtle tension ran like an invisible current. Lydia greeted me with that saccharine smile of hers, the one that always made my skin crawl. "Celine, you look radiant tonight," she said, her eyes glinting with something I couldn't quite name. I forced a smile, nodding politely, but there was a flicker of unease I couldn't shake. Caleb came up beside me, placing his hand on mine in what I thought was a reassuring gesture. "You look beautiful tonight, Celine," he whispered. For a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to believe it was genuine. But then I noticed the way his gaze lingered a second too long on Lydia across the room, and my stomach twisted. The evening progressed, and I tried to immerse myself in the celebration, talking to investors, family friends, and employees who had grown fond of me over the years. Yet every now and then, I caught a flash. A laugh shared between Lydia and Caleb. A secretive glance, a hand brushing a shoulder that was never meant to brush mine. My parents, ever oblivious to subtle truths, lavished praise on Lydia. Vivian whispered to a guest, "Lydia will make the perfect leader of our next branch. Caleb is so lucky." Lucky. That word felt like a punch in the stomach. My parents were openly celebrating a future that excluded me, a partnership that I was meant to ignore. By the end of the night, I couldn't pretend anymore. I slipped into the balcony, the hum of the party muffled behind the doors, and let myself breathe. But I couldn't shake the image of Caleb laughing with Lydia, his hand brushing hers, the easy intimacy that should have been reserved for me. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, that I was being paranoid, but deep down, a chilling realization began to settle in. The person I trusted most in the world, the family I had devoted my life to, was already turning against me. And in that moment, the first seed of anger and resolve took root. I didn't know how yet, but I knew one thing for certain. They would regret underestimating me. It was late one evening when the truth hit me like a freight train. I had stayed late at the office, reviewing the latest profit reports, my mind still replaying the engagement party. The house was quiet, almost suspiciously so, when I decided to check the family wing for some misplaced documents. That's when I saw them, through the slightly ajar door of the study, Lydia and Caleb, laughing softly, their faces inches apart, hands brushing in a way that made my stomach churn. I froze. My heart slammed against my ribs as if warning me not to move, not to witness this. But it was too late. The evidence was undeniable. Every whispered word, every stolen touch, every lie they had told me over the past months crystallized into one horrifying truth. My fiancé was cheating on me with my sister. For a long moment, I didn't breathe. My mind tried to deny it, twist it, make it seem like I had imagined the scene. But the way Caleb leaned into Lydia's laugh, the way Lydia's eyes sparkled with mischief and triumph, it was real. Every piece fell into place. Every suspicious glance at the party, every fleeting interaction, they were all part of this betrayal. I retreated quietly, pretending I hadn't seen anything, my hands trembling as I clutched the edge of the office desk. But inside, something in me had shifted. The hurt, the anger, the disbelief, they all collided, leaving a raw, burning determination in their wake. And then came the confrontation with my parents. I tried desperately to speak up, to demand justice, to expose the betrayal. But Vivian smiled thinly, Gregory shook his head in mild disapproval, and both dismissed my concerns. Celine, you're imagining things. Lydia and Caleb are good for each other. You should be happy for them, they said, their words slicing through me sharper than any blade. I realized in that moment that my family had always chosen appearances over truth. They valued comfort over loyalty, favor over fairness. And in their eyes, I was expendable, a shadow, someone to be overlooked and forgotten. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was systemic. My life, my trust, and the countless hours I had poured into our family business meant nothing to them. Lydia and Caleb had taken everything that mattered to me, my fiancé, my rightful place, and the recognition I had earned. And in that heartbreak, in that crushing sense of injustice, I made a choice. I would not remain the powerless daughter, the invisible worker in my own family's empire. They had underestimated me, and they would pay. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I knew this was the moment where everything changed. My path was no longer about forgiveness or reconciliation. It was about reclaiming what was mine and making sure everyone who had betrayed me felt the consequence. The days after I saw them together were a blur. I went through the motions of life, but every step felt heavy, like I was dragging myself through quicksand. The office, once my sanctuary, became a prison of memories and silent accusations. I couldn't focus, couldn't eat properly, couldn't sleep. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw Lydia and Caleb laughing together, their faces mocking me in ways that no one else could see. Vivian and Gregory continued their performances, pretending everything was normal. At family dinners, they would smile at Lydia as if she had done no wrong, and casually ask me to behave like an adult, while subtly reminding me of all the ways I supposedly fell short. The injustice was suffocating. I felt invisible, humiliated, and utterly powerless. I tried reaching out to Caleb. I needed some explanation, some sign that he cared, that this was a mistake. But the truth came swiftly and without mercy. He didn't feel guilty, and he didn't intend to change anything. He was fully aligned with Lydia now. Their whispers, their secret glances, the way he avoided my eyes, it was all confirmation. I had been betrayed by the two people I trusted most. For weeks I isolated myself. I stopped going to the office, claiming exhaustion and stress. I avoided calls from my parents, their concern dripping with condescension. I cut myself off from friends, feeling that no one could truly understand the depth of my humiliation. My heart ached with a mix of grief and anger so intense it felt physical. I had spent my life building, sacrificing, and trusting, and it had all been used against me. Yet amidst the pain, a spark ignited. A quiet, burning determination, that I would not let this define me. Lydia and Caleb thought they had won. They thought they had destroyed me. But pain can be a teacher, and betrayal can be a weapon if wielded wisely. Slowly, I began to consider a plan, a way to reclaim what had been stolen. I didn't speak of it yet. I didn't confide in anyone. The idea of revenge was like a seed planted in the darkest corner of my heart, growing steadily, quietly, until the right moment. Every insult, every betrayal, every humiliating glance from my family added fuel to that fire. I left the house for a week, staying in a small apartment across town. For the first time in years, I was alone, without the suffocating expectations and manipulations. I spent hours thinking, plotting, and reflecting. I knew that if I were to strike back, it would need to be perfect, swift, devastating. They would never see it coming. And in that week of isolation, I made a promise to myself. When the time came, Lydia, Caleb, and even my parents would understand the cost of underestimating me. My name was Celine Moore, and I was done being invisible. After weeks of solitude, I returned to the family estate. On the surface, I appeared calm, composed, even cheerful. I smiled when I saw Lydia and Caleb, nodded politely at my parents, and congratulated them on the perfect wedding preparations. To the outside world, Celine Moore was back to being the dutiful daughter, the reliable executive, the girl who accepted her place. But inside, everything had shifted. I wore a mask, one I had perfected in my solitude. My voice was light, my expressions carefully measured, my gestures controlled. Nobody could see the storm brewing beneath the surface. Every smile I gave Lydia, every nod to Caleb, was a calculated performance. They had taken everything from me, but they hadn't yet realized the quiet reckoning I had begun to plan. The first step was observation. I watched them closely. Every interaction, every weakness, every crack in their perfect facade. Caleb's pride was his undoing. Lydia's arrogance and impatience were vulnerabilities I intended to exploit. My parents, blinded by their favoritism and obsession with appearances, were unwitting pawns in a game they couldn't comprehend. At the same time, I reconnected with Marcus Hale, my childhood friend and now a trusted confidant. I told him nothing of my intentions, only that I needed guidance, someone to watch my back legally and strategically. He agreed to help, unaware of the full scope of my plans. That was fine. I didn't want anyone to know yet. Not my parents, not Lydia, not Caleb. Slowly, I began collecting information, quietly digging into financial records, contracts, and personal correspondence. Every detail, every secret, every misstep could be turned into leverage. My parents' empire, their family reputation, even the love that Lydia and Caleb thought they had secured, was all vulnerable. And I had the patience and precision to strike when the moment was right. I attended family dinners, smiled at the engagement celebrations, and congratulated Lydia on her successes. Each word, each gesture, was part of the mask I wore flawlessly. To them, Celine Moore had forgiven, forgotten, and returned to her place. But beneath the calm exterior, a plan was forming, a plan that would unravel everything they believed was safe. And as I looked at Lydia, laughing with Caleb over some trivial joke, I realized something chillingly clear. They had underestimated me. They thought I was broken. They thought I was powerless. They were wrong. The quiet storm had begun. The day of Lydia and Caleb's wedding arrived like a storm I had been waiting for. On the outside, it was a dream, an opulent ceremony in a grand hall, white roses cascading from the ceilings, golden chandeliers illuminating the polished floors. Guests in designer dresses and tailored suits moved gracefully. Cameras flashed, and the air was thick with the scent of celebration and champagne. Everyone assumed it was a perfect day, the culmination of love and family unity, but for me, Celine Moore, it was a battlefield. I arrived early, under the guise of helping with last-minute arrangements. Every smile I offered was a mask. Every compliment I whispered to Lydia or Caleb was a lie. Inside, my heart churned with a mixture of rage, sadness, and the icy determination I had cultivated over months of isolation. I watched them, the golden couple, so confident in their perceived triumph, oblivious to the reckoning creeping closer with each passing hour. The ceremony began smoothly. The vows were spoken, the rings exchanged, and the audience oohed and awed at the perfect love story unfolding before them. I clapped along, silently counting every moment, memorizing every expression, and noting every weakness. Caleb's slight twitch when speaking, Lydia's tendency to fidget when she felt anxious, all small details that would later serve as pieces in the puzzle of their undoing. During the reception, I mingled effortlessly, my mask flawless. I laughed at jokes I didn't find funny, offered advice I didn't mean, and praised Lydia in front of the guests, all while plotting the first strikes of my revenge. My parents beamed at her, proud and blind, completely unaware that the daughter they had sidelined was already orchestrating the collapse of their little empire. As the evening wore on, I noticed subtle cracks forming in the seemingly perfect world of the couple. Caleb, emboldened by the audience, made careless jokes about business decisions that hinted at his incompetence. Lydia, intoxicated by attention and wine, boasted about minor achievements she had exaggerated, painting herself as indispensable while revealing her lack of true understanding. Each slip, each misstep, was a potential weapon, and I took mental notes meticulously. Later, during the speeches, I seized the opportunity to plant seeds of doubt subtly. I praised Lydia too effusively, highlighting small inconsistencies in her leadership, while drawing attention to her reliance on Caleb. The audience remained oblivious, but my parents noticed a flicker of discomfort in Lydia's eyes. That flicker was my first victory of the evening, a reminder that appearances can be deceiving and that the perfect facade was fragile. By the end of the night, the golden couple was exhausted and slightly rattled, though they didn't know it yet. I left the wedding with a sense of satisfaction, knowing that the first cracks had appeared. I had acted invisibly, strategically, and without emotion in the public eye, but the storm behind the mask was growing, fueled by years of betrayal and neglect. That night, as I returned to my apartment, I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what I was planning. The betrayal had been personal, but the revenge would be surgical, calculated, and devastating. Caleb and Lydia had assumed they were untouchable, that my heart had been broken and my will crushed. They were wrong. I spent hours mapping out the next steps, documenting every misstep I could exploit, every relationship I could manipulate, and every legal loophole Marcus and I could use. This was no longer about hurt feelings or personal grievances. It was about dismantling their perfect world piece by piece, until they realized that power, reputation, and love can all be illusions, easily taken away by someone who has been underestimated. The night ended with a quiet, almost serene thought. They had built a house of cards, and I held the first gust of wind. The real game was only beginning. In the days following the wedding, I moved like a shadow through the family business. My presence was expected, harmless. Celine Moore had returned, forgiven, and seemingly ready to resume her dutiful role. But beneath that polished surface, every step I took was calculated, every smile a weapon. The months of planning had matured into precise strategies. Now, it was time to act. The first target was Caleb. I knew his arrogance, his pride, his constant need for validation. Those traits, once endearing to my naive heart, would become his undoing. I subtly began planting doubts in key employees' minds about his decisions, leaking minor errors and exaggerating them with careful phrasing so that the gossip network inside the company began to shift. Little by little, whispers spread. Caleb's judgment might not be as sound as he claimed. Simultaneously, I started undermining Lydia's authority without ever appearing confrontational. In board meetings, I would subtly correct her mistakes, phrasing it as helpful advice, complimenting her effort while highlighting gaps in her knowledge. Employees who had once admired Lydia started noticing her mistakes. They felt uncomfortable with her overconfidence. My mask remained flawless, supportive sister, loyal daughter. But the cracks were beginning to show. Outside the office, I worked with Marcus to gather legal leverage. A few minor discrepancies in financial reporting, a neglected clause in a supplier contract, and the hidden consequences of Caleb's reckless decisions became tools we would later use. Each piece was filed away, invisible to my family, but critical for when the moment of reckoning came. At social events, I played my part flawlessly. I congratulated Lydia on her apparent successes, smiled at Caleb's jokes, and even praised Vivian and Gregory for their wisdom in selecting the couple to lead the company. My parents' pride blinded them to everything, but I observed closely, noting weaknesses, hesitations, and insecurities that would later become ammunition. Every small detail mattered: a slipped word, a moment of arrogance, a hint of greed, and then came the first direct strike. Caleb was scheduled to present a critical proposal to a potential investor, a deal that could expand the company's reach. Using subtle manipulations I had set in motion, timely emails, misdirected documents, and gentle advice to employees, he walked into the meeting unprepared. The presentation faltered, numbers were questioned, promises couldn't be substantiated, and the investor walked away uncertain. I wasn't present at the meeting physically, but the satisfaction I felt was indescribable. The first blow had landed quietly, surgically, without anyone suspecting the architect. Lydia would soon hear of Caleb's failure, and when she did, her confidence would falter. And when that happened, she would start to unravel. At home, my mask remained intact. I hugged Lydia warmly, laughed at Caleb's jokes, and even offered him helpful advice in front of my parents. I observed their reactions carefully. The unease in Caleb's eyes, the slight tension in Lydia's posture. It was a subtle victory, but a victory nonetheless. I could feel the tide beginning to turn, and it was intoxicating. By the end of the week, I had seen the first signs of weakness. Caleb began second-guessing himself. Lydia questioned her own decisions, and the employees who had once been loyal to them began looking to me for guidance. The seed of chaos had been planted, and I watered it carefully, invisibly. That night, alone in my apartment, I allowed myself a small, private smile. Revenge was no longer a distant dream. It was unfolding, step by step, perfectly controlled. I had been underestimated, dismissed, and humiliated. But the tables were turning. The empire my parents had thought belonged to Lydia, and Caleb was beginning to slip through their fingers, and I held the map to their undoing. For the first time in months, I slept with a sense of purpose, a quiet excitement simmering beneath the exhaustion. The storm I had cultivated was no longer on the horizon. It was here, and it was only the beginning. The tension in the company began to ripple outward, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but steadily growing. Caleb's confidence was cracking, and Lydia's arrogance began to betray her. Each small misstep, each mistake amplified, became fodder for whispers, rumors, and doubt among employees and investors alike. And I, Celine Moore, was the invisible hand orchestrating it all. It started with minor financial discrepancies, oversights I had discovered and kept secret until the right moment. Marcus helped me frame the documents in a way that suggested negligence on Caleb's part, while subtly implicating Lydia in decisions she hadn't truly overseen. A trusted supplier received a carefully worded email implying that Lydia had mishandled contracts. Word spread, as it always does, and soon there were quiet conversations in corners of the office questioning their competence. At the next board meeting, I maintained my mask of loyalty and calm, nodding and offering advice when Lydia faltered over figures or timelines. I praised her efforts, but each word was carefully chosen to highlight her reliance on others, her lack of initiative. By the end of the meeting, her authority felt fragile, even to her, and Caleb's embarrassment was palpable. Outside the office, I began subtly planting seeds of doubt with investors. Casual conversations over lunch, a concerned inquiry about the leadership duo, a shared anecdote about minor errors. It all painted a picture of a leadership team teetering on the edge. Nobody suspected me. They assumed Celine Moore was still the obedient daughter, quietly supportive. Meanwhile, at home, the tension became almost visible. Lydia was irritable, snapping at minor inconveniences, and Caleb began avoiding eye contact with me, a flicker of recognition in his eyes that I was no longer just the good daughter. My parents, proud of the couple's apparent success, remained oblivious, still basking in the illusion that everything was under control. Then came the first public crack, a minor press article about the family business, which I had subtly influenced through contacts. It hinted at instability at the top, questioning whether the newly appointed leadership could handle an expansion project. Lydia read it, her face flushing with anger and fear. Caleb tried to brush it off, but I saw the tremor in his confidence. That tremor was the exact opening I needed. I began orchestrating small confrontations, knowing that under pressure, the cracks in their relationship would widen. I asked seemingly innocent questions about contracts, suggested revisiting decisions they had made, and praised their efforts in front of staff, all while planting doubt in their minds. The tension between them grew, and they began to bicker in private, their once solid alliance starting to crumble. At the same time, I quietly strengthened my own position. Employees who had once doubted me began to look to me for guidance. My influence grew quietly, invisibly, until the staff started noticing that while Lydia and Caleb faltered, I remained steady, competent, and reliable. The realization was slow, insidious, and unstoppable. I was becoming the backbone of the company while they were unraveling. By the end of the month, the first significant blow landed. A critical investor pulled back funding after hearing about leadership instability. The company's stock dipped slightly, and the tension in the office was palpable. Lydia blamed Caleb, Caleb blamed Lydia, and neither suspected me. I smiled privately, savoring the chaos I had orchestrated so quietly, so perfectly. That night, as I reviewed the day's events alone, I allowed myself a sense of satisfaction. My revenge was no longer a distant plan. It was unfolding, is escalating, and unstoppable. They had taken everything from me, but the scales were finally tipping, and I held the balance. I whispered to myself, almost softly, yet with steel in my voice, "This is only the beginning. They will regret ever underestimating me." By now, the tension between Lydia and Caleb had become almost tangible. What had once seemed like a perfect union, celebrated with lights, laughter, and champagne, was now a fragile illusion teetering on the edge. And I, Celine Moore, watched silently, the architect of their unraveling, my mask flawless, while my plans quietly tightened around them. It started with small arguments. Caleb, humiliated by the investor fallout I had orchestrated, began snapping at Lydia over minor details. "Why didn't you double-check those numbers?" he hissed in frustration one evening after a board meeting. Lydia, confident in public but fragile behind closed doors, snapped back defensively. "I trusted you to handle it. You've been careless all along." Their voices, once harmonious in laughter, now clashed like a storm. I observed them carefully, noting every crack in their armor, each misstep, every impatience. Every overreaction became a tool I could use later. I offered subtle advice when the tensions threatened to spill over in public, careful to appear neutral and supportive while sowing tiny seeds of doubt. "Perhaps you two should review the contract together again. Sometimes the smallest detail can make the biggest difference," I suggested, innocently, yet deliberately nudging them toward further mistakes. Outside the office, I subtly encouraged staff and investors to question their decisions. Casual remarks at lunch, offhanded questions about minor errors, and carefully timed hints painted a growing picture of instability. Caleb's pride suffered, Lydia's patience thinned, and their once solid partnership began to falter under the weight of my invisible hand. The real tipping point came when I discovered Caleb had been hiding another minor indiscretion, an unapproved expense that Lydia had never noticed. Using my careful planning and Marcus's legal expertise, I leaked the information discreetly to the right eyes. The whispers spread, and soon Lydia confronted Caleb in a fit of panic and rage. Their fight erupted into a full-blown argument in front of a small group of employees, exposing their vulnerabilities for all to see. The humiliation was deliciously complete. Lydia, who had once commanded respect through charm and arrogance, was now flustered, defensive, and visibly shaken. Caleb, once confident and charming, now appeared insecure, timid, and unsure of his decisions. Their marriage, which they had paraded as the pinnacle of love and competence, was crumbling before anyone else even realized the depth of the betrayal happening behind the scenes. At home, my parents remained blissfully unaware of the storm. Vivian continued to gush over Lydia's supposed brilliance, while Gregory praised Caleb for being the perfect choice to lead the company. They were blind to the reality. Their golden couple was falling apart, and I was the quiet force behind it all. That night, I allowed myself a rare moment of satisfaction. I sat in my apartment, reviewing the chaos I had orchestrated with meticulous care. Each argument, each mistake, each subtle manipulation had contributed to the collapse of their perfect facade. They had taken everything from me: my fiancé, my rightful recognition, my place in the family, and now I was watching their lives unravel, piece by piece, as they remained oblivious to the true source of their downfall. And as I closed my eyes, I whispered a promise into the darkness. The storm is far from over. Soon they will understand the price of underestimating Celine Moore. The fallout from the wedding and the marriage cracks rippled straight into the business. The empire my parents had built, the one Lydia and Caleb had assumed they could inherit effortlessly, began to crumble. And I, Celine Moore, watched silently, the architect of their undoing, my hands carefully controlling every piece of the chaos. It began with the clients. Minor complaints and delays, strategically orchestrated by me, escalated into doubts about leadership. A major supplier, influenced through subtle insinuations and careful manipulation, questioned Lydia's ability to manage contracts. Investors, already unsettled by the wedding fiasco and whispers of mismanagement, started pulling back funding. Each small disruption I caused compounded into a wave of uncertainty that Lydia and Caleb were too distracted, or too arrogant, to notice. Meanwhile, inside the company, I subtly began consolidating power. Employees who had once admired Lydia now looked to me for guidance, sensing competence, reliability, and foresight that Lydia lacked. I smiled, offered advice, praised the right people, and quietly corrected mistakes without ever overtly undermining anyone. To them, Celine Moore appeared as the same dutiful, loyal daughter, but in truth, I was becoming the backbone of the business. Caleb and Lydia, increasingly tense and argumentative, failed to notice the slow shift in loyalty. Every misstep they made, every overreaction, every careless decision, every argument, further weakened their authority. Their once solid partnership dissolved in private and became painfully visible in public. The staff's whispers, now growing louder, confirmed my dominance without me needing to lift a finger. I also used legal leverage I had quietly amassed over months. Minor discrepancies in contracts, overlooked clauses, and Caleb's reckless expenditures became tools to apply pressure without raising suspicion. Marcus helped me frame situations in a way that forced Lydia and Caleb to rely on my advice, making them unknowingly dependent on the very person they had dismissed and betrayed. The first major confrontation happened during a critical board meeting. I remained calm, composed, and seemingly neutral as I guided discussions subtly, correcting Lydia's errors with a supportive tone. Caleb's pride faltered. Lydia's patience snapped. When investors began expressing concerns about leadership instability, the couple could not respond effectively. The meeting ended in chaos, with both Lydia and Caleb shaken, humiliated, and confused. They had no idea that every mistake, every faltering word, every misstep had been anticipated, manipulated, and exploited by me. By the end of the week, the company teetered on the brink. Investors were hesitant, employees were uneasy, and the once glamorous image of the family empire had started to crack. My parents, still blinded by favoritism and appearances, continued to praise Lydia and Caleb, completely unaware that their empire was slipping through their fingers. And through it all, I remained calm. My mask of loyalty and composure never faltered. I smiled at Lydia's growing anxiety, nodded at Caleb's faltering confidence, and even praised their efforts in front of my parents, all while secretly consolidating my control. Every detail mattered. Every subtle manipulation brought me closer to the ultimate goal: reclaiming what was stolen from me and proving to everyone who had doubted me that underestimating Celine Moore was the gravest mistake they could make. As I sat alone that night, reviewing the unfolding chaos, I allowed myself a rare moment of quiet satisfaction. The house was silent, the city lights flickering faintly through my apartment window, and for the first time in months, I felt a strange mixture of relief and exhilaration. The first phase of my plan had succeeded. The couple had begun to unravel. Caleb's once confident demeanor now trembled under pressure, and Lydia's arrogance had begun to crack in ways I had long anticipated. I leaned back in my chair, letting the exhaustion settle into my bones, but my mind refused to rest. I replayed every meeting, every interaction, every subtle manipulation I had orchestrated over the past weeks. The smiles I had offered Lydia, the carefully worded suggestions to Caleb, the timing of leaks to investors, all of it had been executed flawlessly, and yet the beauty of it was that none of them suspected me. My parents continued to praise Lydia's supposed brilliance, blind to the chaos she was teetering on. Their oblivion only fueled my determination further. I imagined their faces when the next phase hit, when the cracks I had nurtured turned into fractures too large to ignore. I pictured Lydia's forced smile when an important client questioned her competence, Caleb's faltering confidence during a critical meeting, the subtle panic in their eyes as they realized the empire they thought was secure was slipping from their hands. Each vision made my chest tighten with a thrilling intensity I had never experienced before, a mix of vindication and the quiet joy of finally reclaiming power that had been denied to me for so long. The satisfaction was also tinged with a strange kind of sorrow. I remembered the little girl I had once been, who had worked tirelessly, dreaming of approval from my parents and affection from Caleb, only to be pushed aside and ignored. That girl had been buried under layers of pain and betrayal, but now her voice whispered in my mind, "You are unstoppable. You are finally seen. You are in control." I closed my eyes and allowed myself to savor the weight of that control. Every detail I had meticulously planned, every subtle manipulation, every quiet observation, it all converged here, in this moment, giving me a sense of power that was intoxicating and liberating. The empire was shifting beneath Lydia and Caleb's feet, and I, the invisible daughter, had become the center of it all. And I knew, with an unshakable certainty, that the final moves, the ones that would completely shatter their illusion of power, expose every secret, and leave them scrambling in despair, were only a matter of time. The storm I had cultivated was approaching, and when it hit, nothing would ever be the same again. The day I had been waiting for finally arrived. Every observation, every subtle manipulation, every calculated delay had led to this moment. Lydia and Caleb, once the golden couple, were now teetering on the edge of collapse, their confidence shattered, their marriage crumbling, and their empire faltering. And I, Celine Moore, was ready to deliver the final strike. It began subtly, almost innocuously. I called a meeting under the pretense of discussing company strategy, ensuring my parents were present, along with key employees and investors. The room buzzed with polite chatter, everyone unaware that the calm, composed Celine Moore was about to expose the hidden truths that had been carefully accumulating for months. I started with Lydia, praising her past efforts while carefully outlining minor errors that had caused major setbacks. My words were gentle, almost complimentary, but each detail hit hard, revealing incompetence she had been blind to. Lydia's smile faltered, her confidence trembling as she tried to justify herself. I nodded encouragingly, masking the satisfaction that bubbled inside me. Next came Caleb. I highlighted his reckless financial decisions, the missed opportunities, the mistakes that had cost the company credibility with investors. The room fell silent, the weight of truth pressing on everyone present. Caleb's face drained of color, and Lydia's hand clutched his arm in panic, a silent acknowledgement that their perfect facade was crumbling. Then, carefully, I revealed the legal leverage Marcus and I had prepared, contracts that had been neglected, clauses overlooked, and unapproved expenditures, all laid bare. The investors leaned forward, whispering to each other, eyes widening in concern. My parents, once blind to reality, finally began to see cracks in the empire they had so proudly handed over to Lydia and Caleb. The most satisfying moment came when I revealed how much I had known all along: Caleb's secret indulgences, Lydia's manipulations, the lies they had told me, the betrayals they had committed. The room was stunned into silence. Every smile they had once worn, every confident step they had taken, now collapsed under the weight of exposure. I watched as their reactions unfolded, the anger, the panic, the realization that their control had been an illusion. Lydia's face twisted in fury and disbelief. Caleb's eyes darted around, searching for allies who weren't there. My parents, for the first time, looked at me not as a shadow, but as the force that had orchestrated their family's reckoning. And I smiled. Not cruelly, not with glee, but with a quiet, steady satisfaction. I had been underestimated, dismissed, and betrayed. Now, every deception, every lie, every attempt to sideline me had been met with consequence. I had reclaimed not just my place in the family, but my power, my dignity, and my voice. By the end of the day, the damage was irreversible. Lydia and Caleb's influence had been dismantled, the company's confidence shaken, and their marriage teetered on the edge of collapse. I remained calm, composed, a figure of reliability and foresight, the only one standing tall amidst the chaos I had orchestrated so meticulously. As I left the meeting, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The storm I had cultivated had finally hit, leaving devastation in its wake. But it was not chaos I reveled in, it was justice. Every betrayal, every humiliation I had endured had been avenged. And finally, Celine Moore was seen, respected, and unbroken. The days following the reckoning were surreal. The once bright halls of the family estate felt heavy with tension and disbelief. Lydia and Caleb no longer commanded respect. Employees whispered about their failures behind closed doors, and investors approached me directly, seeking guidance and reassurance. The empire they had assumed was theirs was now in my steady hands, or at least under my influence, and the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. My parents were silent at first, stunned by the revelations I had laid bare. Vivian avoided eye contact, her pride bruised, her illusions shattered. Gregory, usually unflappable, seemed almost lost, realizing that their golden couple had been nothing more than smoke and mirrors. I remained composed, calm, offering explanations, guidance, and support, while internally savoring the shift that had finally occurred. Lydia and Caleb, once so confident and arrogant, were shadows of their former selves. They tried to maintain appearances for the staff, for the investors, even for my parents. But their cracks were evident to everyone. Every misstep they had made, every bad decision, every lie I had uncovered, had come back to haunt them. I watched as Lydia struggled to justify her authority, and Caleb floundered under scrutiny, knowing full well that their empire and their reputation were no longer theirs to control. I used this moment to consolidate my position. Employees who had once been loyal to Lydia and Caleb now looked to me as a pillar of stability and competence. I carefully guided decisions, corrected mistakes discreetly, and subtly reminded everyone, without boasting, that I had always been here, competent and capable. My mask of loyalty remained intact, but underneath, I felt a quiet pride that was unshakable. Outside the office, whispers of the internal turmoil spread. Clients began reaching out to me, seeking assurance, and I realized how much influence I now held. Every word, every decision, every piece of advice I offered further cemented my role as the true leader. Lydia and Caleb could only watch, powerless, as I quietly became indispensable. At home, the family dynamics had shifted as well. My parents treated me with a new respect, tempered by the realization that they had underestimated me for years. They asked for my guidance on decisions, sought my input on disputes, and, most importantly, could no longer ignore me. The invisible daughter they had once dismissed had become the center of both business and family influence, and yet, amidst the triumph, I felt a quiet melancholy. The vengeance I had orchestrated had been thorough and complete, but it had come at a cost. I had sacrificed months of peace, endured heartbreak, and walked through the shadows of betrayal. The satisfaction of justice was tempered by the knowledge that relationships could never return to what they once were. Still, I allowed myself one small smile as I reflected on the journey. Lydia and Caleb had learned, perhaps too late, the consequences of underestimating me. My parents had finally recognized my worth, and I, Celine Moore, had reclaimed everything I deserved, not just my rightful place in the family and business, but my voice, my power, and my dignity. The storm had passed, leaving ruin behind, but out of that ruin, a new order had emerged. And for the first time in years, I felt an unshakable sense of control, of clarity, and of freedom. The months that followed the reckoning felt almost dreamlike. The empire my parents had built, the one Lydia and Caleb had assumed was theirs, was now firmly stabilized under my careful guidance. The company was recovering. Employees looked to me with respect rather than fear, and investors trusted my decisions. The chaos I had orchestrated had settled into a new order, one in which I was no longer invisible, no longer sidelined, and no longer underestimated. I walked through the office one morning, observing the subtle signs of my influence. Employees moved confidently, tasks were executed efficiently, and the energy that had once been tense and fearful was replaced by a cautious optimism. Lydia, now quieter, avoided confrontation. Caleb, humbled, no longer tried to assert dominance. Their pride had been broken, their facade removed, and in its place was a tense acknowledgement of my authority. It wasn't malice, it was recognition. At home, my parents treated me with a newfound respect, tinged with guilt and awe. Vivian no longer dismissed my opinions, instead asking for guidance and insight. Gregory, reserved as ever, nodded at my observations with a quiet approval. The family dynamics had shifted irrevocably. I had reclaimed my place not through charm or patience, but through persistence, intelligence, and careful strategy. And yet, as powerful as the triumph felt, I knew that life would never be the same. Lydia and Caleb were still family, and while they had been humbled, they remained a part of my world. I didn't relish their suffering anymore. The initial satisfaction of revenge had given way to a reflective calm. I had proven myself, reclaimed my voice, and restored my dignity. But the emotional cost was something I carried silently. One evening, alone in my apartment, I allowed myself to reflect fully on the journey. The pain, the betrayal, the months of planning, and the careful execution of my revenge had changed me irrevocably. I had discovered a strength within myself I never knew existed, a combination of patience, cunning, and resilience that had carried me through the darkest moments. I realized that the true victory wasn't the downfall of Lydia and Caleb, but the reclamation of my own life, my agency, and my self-worth. As I looked out at the city lights, I whispered to the quiet night, "I am Celine Moore. I am seen. I am heard. I am in control." The words were not boastful. They were a statement of survival, a declaration of resilience, and a promise to myself that I would never again be underestimated or overlooked. I traced the lights with my eyes, each window a story, each flicker a reminder that the world continued to turn, oblivious to the quiet battles fought in the shadows. But I had fought mine, and I had won. The family business would continue, its operations steady under my guidance. Yet the relationships within it had been permanently altered. Lydia and Caleb no longer held the unchallenged authority they had once flaunted so arrogantly. Their presence, once intimidating, was now cautious, measured, even tentative. They had learned the consequences of deceit, the price of hubris, and the power of a voice that had long been ignored. My parents, who had turned a blind eye to favoritism and betrayal for years, finally looked at me with recognition, understanding that the daughter they had dismissed was capable, perceptive, and unyielding. And I, at last, had learned to forgive. Not them, not fully, but myself, for enduring, for surviving, and for transforming every wound, every slight, every act of betrayal into strength. I allowed myself to remember the girl I had once been, the one overlooked, humiliated, and broken, and I marveled at the woman I had become. The patience, the meticulous planning, the careful observation, all of it had culminated not just in revenge, but in empowerment. I had turned suffering into a path of self-realization, and in doing so, I had reclaimed my life. The storm was over, the dust had settled, and a new era had begun, not one of chaos, but one of clarity, strength, and quiet, unwavering control. I could feel it in the subtle deference of employees, the cautious respect in Lydia's voice, the humbled restraint in Caleb's demeanor. It was not the control of fear, but the authority of competence and strategy, the undeniable proof that I could navigate, endure, and emerge victorious. For a long time, I had felt invisible, powerless, dismissed, but no longer. Every betrayal, every slight, every obstacle had been transformed into a stepping stone. The quiet victories, the calculated strikes, the patient waiting, it all led to this moment of equilibrium where respect was earned and injustice was corrected. Celine Moore was no longer a shadow, no longer the silent daughter in the corner, overlooked and underestimated. She was a force, intelligent, deliberate, and unshakable. And as I turned from the window, letting the glow of the city fade behind me, I felt a profound sense of completeness. There would be no more compromises, no more silence, no more overlooked worth. I had reclaimed everything that had been taken, not through anger alone, but through strategy, patience, and resilience. The journey had been painful, but the destination was absolute. I had survived, I had triumphed, and I had finally, irrevocably, become the person I was always meant to be.